Erev Tov. Okay, so we start again from Parashat Bereshit this week, as you may have noticed. So it's a good opportunity to talk about Shnayim, beMikra, and Targum. Now, there are many weekly, daily learning programs nowadays. Daf Yomi is very popular, Baruch Hashem. There's Mishnah Yomi, and there's Rambam Yomi, and there's Nach Yomi, and there's Zohar Yomi. Whatever you want, you can find a Yomi. But what's that? But still, the most popular learning program to date is still, the most successful, is still Parashat Shavua. Because everybody, wherever you go, whatever it is, we all learn the same parasha every week. I sometimes wonder, there used to be, going back in the days of the Gemaras, there were two different cycles. There was a difference between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, where they would either finish the Torah in 1 year, the custom in Eretz Yisrael was to finish in 3 years. So the advantage of that is that the parashas are much shorter. You can actually spend a lot more time learning and in depth. Maybe the disadvantage is you have 3 years in between to forget what happened. So it's, I don't know. And of course, you only would have Simchat Torah once every 3 years. So. But in any event...
were actually reformatted so that they were shorter?
But they were split up differently. So they would, well, I'm not sure when they stopped, but we follow the custom, which was in Bavel, which is that we complete the cycle every year. But there was... No. So that's the chapters. When you look inside the Sefer Torah, if you look in any Chumash, so you'll see there's a gap between what we call parashiyot, what's called parashah ptucha and parashah stuma. So you see at the end of a pasuk, sometimes you see the letter pei or the letter samach. It's printed in the Chumash. That's where there's a break between sections. That's part of the Masorah, that division amongst the sections, different parashiyot. That was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, as is the chalukah, the difference between different parashiyot. That is part of that as well. What was introduced later on is the chapters. Again, the psukim as well. That's part of they put the chapters. Perek, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, whatever it is. That is later on. We use that. It's become universally accepted out of convenience. But that was introduced by the non-Jewish printers, and there are some very obvious examples where those chapters are very much out of sync. Just to give an example, so you get to you look at the story of creation, right? And Perek Bet opens in a place that really should not be a new Perek. That's a continuation of Perek Aleph. You can look it up afterwards, and there are other examples like that. But the difference between the parashah, that's in our tradition. But the chalukah, the breakup, how we have like different which parashah we read each week. So that's become universally accepted that we follow the minhag, but there was a minhag that split it up every 3 years. What's also become more or less universally accepted is the break between the aliyot, right? Any chumash, there are some places where there are different minhagim. Where do you end Rishon and where do you start Sheni and Shlishi, etc. But those are not. That's we spoke about it once, but that's a somewhat arbitrary division as to how that is. In any event, so we have a chiyuv. Really, we have an obligation. It's brought in the Shulchan Aruch, it's based on the Gemara and Brachot, on Daf Chet. But the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Pei Hey tells us about the mitzvah of Likra parashah, Shnayim beMikra ve'echad Targum. And he writes, Af al pi she'adam shomea kol haTorah kula kol Shabbat b'tzibur. That's a given, right? You're going to come to shul and you're going to hear the Torah with the tzibur. We discussed once as well the obligation. Is there an obligation to hear the Torah in shul? Is that a chovat hayachid or a chovat hatzibur? According to most, obviously you can't have Kriyat Torah unless you have a minyan. But the question is it incumbent on each individual to hear that Kriyat Torah? According to probably the more common opinion is no, it's a Chovat HaTzibur, the obligation on the community to have the Torah reading read. But nonetheless, a person comes to shul and a person hears the parasha, nonetheless, chayav likrot le'atzmo b'chol shavua, parashat oto hashavua. You still need to read to yourself that week, the parasha of that week, Shnayim beMikra ve'echad Targum. We'll talk about what each is about. Shnayim beMikra means, Mikra is the psukim, is the verses. One is obligated to read through the entire parasha twice, and once to read the Targum. Now the Targum, once upon a time, the word Targum means translation. The Targum that we have, Targum Onkelos, is not just a translation. It's a perush as well. It's an interpretation, and there's some very nice modern editions of Chumash for the Targum, where they actually put in bold every time there's a change or every time there's a word that is added, so you can easily follow it. But the Targum is essentially a perush. When it was written, and when everybody understood Aramaic, so obviously it was much easier. You're reading the parashah, and you don't understand necessarily what it means, so then you read it, the Targum, the translation, the perush in Aramaic, which is the language that you speak, and it all makes sense. Nowadays, The problem that we have is we read the parashah, we think we understand at least the parashah, we read the Targum, we definitely don't understand anything. So the question is, if you don't understand the Targum, should you read something else? So that's in Seif Bet. But he adds, Isafilu atarot v'divon, meaning even those places where there are words, which are the names of places, for example, which has the same Targum as the Mikra, nonetheless, there you still have to read the Targum as well. Now, the reason the Shulchan Aruch writes, and he starts off by saying, Af al pi sh'adam shomea kol haTorah kula kol sholat b'tzibur, even though you've heard the Torah in the tzibur, because there was a Hava minute to say, one of the Rishonim writes this, but that this chovah, this obligation, and again, this is not, Shnayim Mikra it's not a nice thing to do, it's not a midat chasidut, it's an obligation, it's a chovah, everybody should be doing it. There is an opinion that says that why would you have to read Shnayim Mikra v'chad Targum if you miss the Kriyat HaTorah b'tzibur? That's brought in Hagot Maimoniot. There is a lone solitary opinion, but the general mainstream opinion of the poskim is no. This is even for somebody who's heard Torah in the tzibur. Now, where this became very relevant was a few years ago. Let's say a person is unable to come to shul, or if shul was closed, let's say there's a worldwide pandemic and shuls are closed and there's no Torah readings. So in such a situation, you would have all the more so you would have an obligation. But nonetheless, even though we come in, we hear it in shul, everybody has to read Shnayim Mikra v'echad Targum to themselves as well. So the Mishnah Berurah here writes, he says, Likrot asmo b'kol shavua, says you're required to do this every week. Ainu shelo yakdim likrot kodem oto shavua. You can't get a head start. The point is that you're reading the parasha together that's being read of that week. So it's like, it's like daf yomi. Like some people say, I've got a head start. I've learned the daf for the whole month. But that's not the point. The point is you're meant to learn it every day, right? So that's the idea. It has to be every week. Don't get ahead. And you should not delay either. Tzarech lashlim parashiotav im hatzibur. Im hatzibur means in the same week that the tzibur is reading it. That's a quote from the Gemara. It says anybody who does this, they will have the length of days, their days and years will be extended. So the joke is always people say, I don't have, I'm so busy, I don't have time to do Shnayim Mikra v'echad Targum. It's like, well, it says you do Shnayim Mikra, you'll have the time. Okay. Shnayim Mikra, אבל לא יקרא אחד מקרא ואחד תרגום ויכוון לשמוע מהשליח ציבור. So says the Mishnah Berurah, what does it mean? You have to read the Mikra twice and you have to read the Targum once, means you have to read it. The fact that you don't say, I'll read it once and then I'll hear the Baal Koreh reading, so that's twice. No, you have to read it twice. Can you mumble along with that? Oh. So first he writes, yes, he says, Im lo shakra as gam ken befiv. In other words, if you mouth along, but you have to make sure you have the entire parashah, so then that counts, because then you've read it as well. He says, Ayen magen Avram shekadav v'shem lechem chamudot, ub'diavad yatsa pa'am achad b'ma shema me'ashlech tzibur. So there is an opinion, it's a minority opinion again, Magen Avram who says that if you heard it from the Shliach Tzibur, that could count as one. What definitely does not count is if you're reading it while you're hearing it from the Shliach Tzibur, you're going to say, well, the Shliach Tzibur read it, that's one, and I read it, that's one. No, that certainly does not count. But that will count as one, it doesn't count as two. Okay, so there's so according to the Magen Avraham, there is an opinion that says b'diavad, but it certainly can't count as twice. The most can count for is one. The most can count for is once, but because the chiyuv is right. So maybe I'll tell you why. Because maybe the question, we're not going to get into it now, but the question is why. The Gemara says that we have this chiyuv, but it doesn't explain why. Why does a person have to read Shnayim Mikra v'echad Targum? You're going to hear it with the tzibur anyway. Why do you have to read it separately? So there are different opinions that are brought. The Trumat Hadeshen has a tshuva, and he says one of the reasons is in order that a person has to prepare themselves for the Kriyah B'tzibur. Meaning, there are those who say that once upon a time, that if a person got an aliyah, you didn't know if you were going to get an aliyah. The Gavai didn't have these golden cards to give you before you get a shlishi ravi or whatever. So you just get called up. And nowadays we have a Baal Koreh, but we didn't always. Once upon a time, a person got called up, and now we have to read the aliyah. So there were those who say that maybe the idea is you have to prepare, you have to know, you have to be able to read, not necessarily to be able to read it from the Torah, but to be able to understand and to know and have proficiency in the parasha. If the point is that you have to read it yourself before you hear it with the tzibur. So clearly, hearing it from the shliach tzibur is not going to be enough. So part of it is that you have to understand. There are communities to this day who still do relate the Targum, by the way. But part of it here is to do with the learning. So we'll get to that in a moment, because the question comes up nowadays. If the person doesn't really understand the Targum, is there still value in reading the Targum, or should you do something else? But before that, so what's the order that one has to read it? The Mishnah Berurah says there are different opinions amongst the Achronim regarding how to do what's the Seder HaKriyah. Yesh omrim shekra kol pasuk bet pamim v'targum alav. There are those who say do it pasuk by pasuk. Every pasuk, read the pasuk twice and then read the Targum. There are those who say yesh omrim shekra kol parashah bet pamim v'achar kach hatargum. Every parashah does not mean the parashat Shavua. It means the parashat Tuchan Stumah, those breaks in between within the parasha. Every mini parasha, let's say, that you read that parasha, the psukim, and then you read the Targum. Right, and there are different ways. So he brings the Magen Avraham says one way, the Gra says a different way. Or achar makom shena yoter hafsek inyan. Okay, and then at the end of the day, he says David kamar Avid or David kamar Avid. So long as at the end of the day a person ends up reading the whole parasha twice and ends up reading the Targum once, it doesn't matter what order you do it in. Whatever works for you, you have what to rely on, and that's fine. And then he says somebody who knows the Ta'amim, so it's better to read it with the Ta'amim. Okay. Now, the next if the Shulchan Aruch says like this. He says, Im lamar parasha beperush Rashi. So if you learned it together with Rashi, chashuv k'mo Targum. That is considered like the Targum. So it could be Shnayim Mikra v'echad Rashi. That also seems to work. And then he says, Yarei Shamayim Mikra Targum v'gam perush Rashi. So if you read the best ways, because there are opinions that say it's good with Targum, the opinions say it's good with Rashi. So if you really want to satisfy all opinions, do both. What's the machloket? What's behind it? So again, if the idea is that you're reading the Targum, or reading Shnayim Mikra, and you're reading the Targum in order to understand, so if I don't understand the Targum, then I haven't really fulfilled much. I haven't done anything. I'm just saying words. But Rashi is part of the reason why we said you need to do Targum is because it's not just a translation, but it's a perush, it's an explanation. Rashi is an explanation, and we understand, and that's okay. There's discussion here. What about other translations? So generally speaking, we say that it's probably better to do Rashi, with the assumption that one understands, than to do another translation. The point about the Targum Onkelos, the Gemara in Megillah tells us that was given at Sinai. That those contains it was written with a certain level of Ruach HaKodesh, and that is why certainly those that are more Kabbalistically inclined would suggest. Rav Avadia writes, for example, he says that even if a person doesn't understand Onkelos, since it was given at Sinai, there's something about this idea of Shnayim Mikra, it's something about the idea of Kratat Torah in general, that it's almost a reenactment of the giving of the Torah in a certain level. And therefore, he says there's an aspect that it's better to read the Targum than to read Rashi. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch says, Shulchan Aruch obviously predating Rav Avadia, but the Shulchan Aruch says that Yerei Shamayim should read both. Okay, at the end of the day, I'll say the same thing the Mishnah Berurah said in the previous seif regarding what order you should do it. David kamar Avid or David kamar Avid. Meaning at the end of the day, is what's relying on each of these. A person should do whatever's going to work for them. People find it easier to read. Right? People will say, if I'm going to read it with Rashi, at least I understand and I know what I'm doing, and then I'll do it. If I'm going to try and do it with Rashi and Targum, I think I'm going to read with Targum. I'm going to sit for half an hour and I'm going to read the Targum, and it's not going to make any sense to me. So then I'm not going to do it. Somebody else might say, okay, I'm not going to go and sit and break my, struggle through Rashi. At least if I do the Targum, I'll get it done. So I would say, whatever a person knows that they're going to read and going to get it done, at the end of the day, that way, that's better. I think for most people, probably Rashi is better than the Targum because you can understand. And he writes here as well, what about the Psukim that don't have Perush Rashi? So there, you would just read that Pasuk 3 times, and that way you would still fulfill the obligation.